Vaccination Station on COVID-19 vaccines. We are part of Team Flapjack Lakes. Presenting today on behalf of our team is Vlad, Courtney, formerly Adriana, myself, Melinda, and Zach. Our agenda today: categories of vaccine, the manufacturers, Washington State's plan of action. Have you ever been on a call and heard the following? I have COVID-19 now, so when can I get the vaccine? When can we all expect to get it? Do I have to get the vaccine? What are the side effects? How effective are they? And what's the difference between these vaccines? And now I'd like to introduce Courtney.
First, we have a short video that's going to go over the 3 types of vaccines we'll be looking at: mRNA, viral vector, and protein subunit.
All COVID-19 vaccines being developed aim to produce immunity to the SARS-CoV-2 virus by stimulating an immune response to an antigen, usually the characteristic spike protein found on the surface of the virus. Some traditional vaccines achieve this by modifying the virus to weaken or disable it, so that when introduced to the body, an immune response can be generated to the antigen, without the virus causing disease. When the immune system comes into contact with the weakened virus, its defences, such as antibodies and T cells, attack the virus or infected cells. In the process, specialised memory cells take note of the specific antigen and prime the immune system to produce cells and antibodies that will quickly target these proteins. So the next time that person is exposed to the same virus, the immune system is ready to fight it off. Instead of using the whole virus, another way to trigger immunity involves using just fragments of it, like the spike proteins. These subunit vaccines have the advantage of being relatively easy and cheap to produce, and are incapable of causing disease because these fragments are not able to infect host cells. However, they are less likely to be recognised by immune cells aimed at attacking infected cells, which means they may trigger a weaker immune response. Because of this, subunit vaccines often include chemical agents called adjuvants, which are designed to stimulate a stronger immune response, and booster shots may also be required. Not all vaccines are designed to introduce antigens to the body. Some work by using cells in a patient's body to produce the antigens themselves. Examples include viral vector vaccines and mRNA vaccines. In both cases, the goal is to get a short fragment of genetic code taken from the target pathogen, in this case the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19, into the patient's cells. By hijacking the cellular mechanisms, these kinds of vaccines mimic the way viruses normally reproduce during natural infection. But rather than creating copies of the virus, the cells only produce large amounts of antigen that then usually trigger a strong immune response. Viral vector vaccines achieve this by inserting the genetic code for the antigen into a harmless virus, which effectively acts like a delivery system to get the code into the cells without causing disease. Vector-based vaccines can be complex to develop, but they can trigger strong immune responses without the need for adjuvants. And in theory, one type of vector can be used to deliver code for a range of different antigens, which can speed up vaccine development. Nucleic acid vaccines, like mRNA and DNA vaccines, also involve inserting genetic code into cells to produce antigens. But instead of using viruses to deliver the code, these vaccines take a more direct approach that involves inserting the code directly into cells, either by attaching it to a molecule or by forcing it into cells using a gene gun. These vaccines can be quick and cheap to develop, but they are a relatively new technology. With hundreds of COVID-19 vaccines now in development, it's likely that a mixture of different approaches will be needed in order to stop the global spread of this coronavirus and end the pandemic.
From the 3 vaccine types that we're looking at, protein subunit, which includes the Novavax vaccine, viral vector, which includes the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and mRNA, which includes both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, they require 2 doses within a certain period of time because there are 2 main types of B cells used in the antibody making process. There's long-lived plasma cells and memory B cells. Long-lived plasma cells are found in the bone marrow, and they continue to produce antibodies after the first dose of the vaccine has been given, which is why there is some protection after the first dose. Memory B cells, on the other hand, are activated after the first dose, but don't produce enough antibodies until they're stimulated either by the second dose or by the virus itself. So the first shot of the vaccine starts the process of making antibodies, and the second shot triggers the memory B cells to make more antibodies, providing the body with more protection. That's why it's important to get both doses if the vaccine you're getting requires 2, and then the recommended amount of time. And next we have Vlad, who will go more into the vaccine manufacturers.
Hey there, I'm going to talk about the manufacturers. So there are a lot of different vaccine manufacturers. This graphic that is shown on the presentation slide shows some of the most prominent companies, people who have either received an emergency use authorization by the Federal Drug Administration, or overseas companies who are heavily involved in research. So the ones that you see here that are highlighted with the darker blue color, Moderna, BioNTech, Pfizer, University of Oxford, AstraZeneca, Sinopharm in Beijing, and the Gamaleya Research Institute. So those are some of the most prominent players, and most recently, Johnson & Johnson has also been granted a emergency use authorization by the FDA upon finishing their phase 3 clinical trials. So, we only really hear some of the main players in our day-to-day lives, just the ones that bubble up to the surface, but there are a lot of people involved in making this vaccine, and different types of vaccines as well. So one of the first things I want to talk about, since we're in the United States, our vaccine authorization process is funneled through the Federal Drug Administration. And for them, there's a process called, or what is known as an emergency use authorization. And the reason this is important is because all of the vaccines that have recently been introduced into the market, they haven't been federally approved. There's no FDA approval because an approval process takes many years of research on how this drug affects people over long-term studies. And since people are only now getting vaccinated en masse, there's no grounds for an approval just yet. But instead, what is done is these companies are granted an emergency use authorization to basically facilitate the availability of this medical countermeasure during a public health emergency like the current COVID-19 pandemic. So under an emergency use authorization, the FDA may allow the use of unapproved medical products or unapproved uses of approved medical products in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions when certain criteria have been met. There's really no alternative that we have currently available for ending this pandemic. So this is the tool that we use to move forward. And companies can only receive an emergency use authorization after phase 3 clinical trials have been conducted, which usually consist of a pool of about anywhere in the tens of thousands of participants. Some companies having pools as large as 40,000. Oh, I went a little quick there. So the first vaccine manufacturer I want to mention, so the ones that I will talk about are the most prominent ones, the ones that we hear all the information about, the ones that are currently being administered in the United States, and also abroad, but just the main players. So the first one, BioNTech Pfizer. A couple statistics here on the top left. So the effectiveness of this vaccine is 95%. It's a mRNA type, and the dose is 2 injections separated by 21 days. And some of the side effects of this vaccine, one thing you'll see in the following slides for all of the various manufacturers is that the symptoms mimic some of the things that we ask in our contact tracing surveys, because essentially the spike protein response that's happening in the body, it triggers a very similar immune response as COVID-19 does. It's much less severe in its duration and also its impact on the human body, but it does elicit some of the same responses. Things like headache, muscle pain, chills, fever, things we're fairly common and familiar with. So BioNTech Pfizer, there's a little timeline right there. Very quick process here. Phase 3 clinical trials were about 43,000 people. They received FDA emergency approval on December 11th, 2020. And a couple extra things to know about this one. Since it's an mRNA vaccine and proteins like the genetic material denatures quickly at high temperatures, it needs to be kept very, very cold for it to not degrade to the point where it won't be effective in the human body. So it's kept at minus 70 degrees Celsius. And BioNTech Pfizer is one of the main ones being administered in the United States right now, and they've been contracted for 200 million doses with the United States. Moving forward is Moderna, also of type mRNA, effectiveness 94%, and a dose of 2 injections 28 days apart. Very similar side effects due to it being an mRNA vaccine, similar as the previous one. And some of the, also a very quick timeline of development, from being in a computer design in January 2020 to human study in just 3 months is pretty unprecedented progress in terms of vaccine manufacturing. The phase 3 clinical trial was about 28,000 people. It's considered safe, no unexpected or serious side effects, and they received FDA approval on December 18th in 2020. It has somewhat less extreme cold storage requirements, minus 20 degrees Celsius. The difference for this compared to the previous BioNTech requirement of minus 70, even though it's the same type of vaccine, Moderna has just said that in their studies, it's been shown that minus 20 degrees is effective. So I guess just statistically and based off of their trials, they say that it's minus 20, which is somewhat less extreme, which makes it easier to transport. But Moderna has come under some public scrutiny for the price that they're charging per dose, as well as their intellectual property claims. Moderna has said it won't enforce patent rights for the duration of the pandemic, but moving forward past the pandemic, it may seek to capitalize on this technology. The next one is of a viral vector type, the University of Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. It's shown to be 66% effective with a dose of 2 injections spaced between 4 to 12 weeks apart. Very similar symptoms here, somewhat different, somewhat different than the mRNA types, but still very, very COVID-like symptoms. Flu-like symptoms, fever, chills, fatigue, and sometimes dizziness, abdominal pain, but those are very uncommon. And the phase 3 clinical trial here was about It's also in the tens of thousands of people. It's been authorized in the United Kingdom for use, but it's still under study in the United States as of when I was doing this research. Something to mention is that the progress here is moving so quickly that every new week there's a new development, new vaccine company that comes into play. Johnson and Johnson just got approved, and when I was doing this research, Johnson and Johnson was not approved. So things are moving very quick. And the benefit here with a viral vector is that it doesn't have to be kept quite as cold, 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, so refrigeration temperatures rather than freezing temperatures, which makes it a lot easier to transport. And they've been contracted for 400 million doses with the United Kingdom, but it's still under study in the United States. Then there's the Johnson & Johnson, also viral vector, effectiveness 66%, similar to the last one. But it's an only one dose injection, which is the benefit here. It makes moving through vaccinations a lot quicker if people only need to have to come through for one dose. And let's see, very common symptoms, or very similar symptoms to the last type of vaccine. Very large clinical trial size of 43,000 participants. It's also considered safe, no unexpected or serious side effects. And Johnson & Johnson was granted the Federal Drug Administration EUA, or emergency use authorization, on the 27th of February, so very recently. And they've begun shipments in the United States. Also only cold storage, so 2 to 8 degrees Celsius makes it very easy to transport. In certain areas, at least in the United States, where there is a refrigeration transport system, it can be done. And they've been contracted for 100 million doses with the United States. And finally, here we have Novavax, and the reason I wanted to bring this one up is because it's a protein-based. It's the protein subunit that the video discussed. Effectiveness of 89%, which is higher than the viral vector type, and it's a 2-dose injection. And the side effects are also very similar to the previous ones. The phase 3 clinical trial is about 30,000 participants. Also, this one's considered safe. And let's see, so the benefit here in comparison to the previous types of vaccines is that it has a higher effectiveness than a viral vector vaccine, but it's also cheaper than mRNA vaccines, and it only has to be kept at refrigeration temperatures. So the cost here per dose is $16 per dose versus $37 per dose with Moderna. And although for one dose, paying double the price, it's manageable, but on a large scale, doubling the overall expenditure is pretty significant for when you're considering, a population of 300 million people. And yeah, so that's the benefits here. They still haven't finished their phase 3 trials, so it's yet to be determined if they'll be a big player in ending this pandemic. And now I will pass it on over to Zach, who will talk about Washington State's plan of action in vaccination.
Awesome. Thank you, Vlad. So I'm going to go over Washington State's just distribution plan of the vaccine. So currently we're in phase 1B tier 1. So this just means that anybody 65 years or older is available to get the vaccine, as well as people 50 or older who live in a multi-generational household. So most recently, this was like 6 days ago, they added educators and childcare workers to the phase. So educators was anybody kindergarten through 12th grade. And then, of course, this is in addition to the original group of people, which is the first responders, people who live in long-term care facilities, and all other workers in the healthcare facility or healthcare setting who are at risk of COVID-19. So you can check and see if you're available to get the vaccine. The Department of Health actually has a tool for it called the Phase Finder tool. So if you just go to the link at the top of the screen there, findyourphasewa.org, you can take a survey and it'll let you know if you're eligible or not. Cool thing is, if you're not eligible at the moment, it'll notify you as soon as you are. So that's kind of cool. In terms of distribution, the CDC is in charge of all that. So there are many factors they're keeping in mind, including disproportionately impacted communities, and like Vlad was mentioning about the different requirements for storing each vaccine, proper transportation for those will be a major factor. And then as we move into spring, we'll eventually roll into Tier 2 Phase 1B, and this is just going to open the vaccine to some more high-risk critical workers. So these are people working in like agriculture and food production. On the next slide here, we want to take a look at the demographic information of Washington. Specifically, I want to look at the Hispanic population, just to kind of show how COVID has disproportionately impacted different communities. You can see that the Hispanic population makes up 13% of Washington, but they're 32% of cases. So this is definitely something to keep in mind when distributing the vaccine. Next, we kind of came up with some areas of action, just some different things to focus on when distributing the vaccine. So I can let you look through them, but one I want to mention for sure is just to make sure that handling the vaccine goes well. So we just want to make sure that we're preparing the handlers of it, just to make sure none of it goes to waste and all those requirements for each vaccine are met. And then finally here, we just have some more critical populations you can look at. Yeah, there's just some different groups here. And yeah, that wraps up our presentation. Yeah, so thank you guys so much.